All right, welcome to our session, Sound for Video session. Today is the 16th of March in this particular time zone. For those of you that are on the other side of the the date line, it's the 17th of March 2016. And today we're going to talk a little bit about recording dialogue audio in stereo versus mono, and by extension, surround sound. So uh, let me first address a question. We had Gary Davies left a question over on the Google Plus site, and I think it was a very good one. Let's see if we can pull that up here. Here we go. Okay. He said, Gary Davies, thanks for the invite, Curtis. Question for consideration. Are matched pair mics set up in an XY configuration a good option? And are they an economical option for the amateur filmmaker? That is a very good question. And in fact, Gary, I think I want to come back to that question. But I wanted to bring it up first because I think this is this is a topic that is I know for me, I very much misunderstood the the value of stereo and surround when I first started, and how it relates specifically to recording dialogue audio for film and video when I first started recording audio. So there are a couple of things to consider. I will start, and I'm not trying to be critical here. This is a little bit of a I'm a little bit opinionated here. um, but I think it will make some sense once we talk about it in a little bit more detail. So, first of all, I would suggest, particularly for those who are just starting uh, recording audio, if you're recording dialogue, I would highly recommend you avoid recording in stereo, and highly recommend that you avoid recording with any sort of surround type microphone array. And some recorders, like I think the Zoom H2, has some surround recording capabilities. I think that surround and stereo are really, really useful. But when you're actually recording dialogue, I think you really need to stick with mono. And what I mean by that is one microphone per voice, or per talent. So the question and the whole landscape sort of changes when you're recording ambiance. And for ambiance, I think that stereo and surround microphone arrays are a great option there if you're trying to go for a particular effect. But again, for dialogue, in most of the major motion pictures, they are recording dialogue to this day in mono because voices are mono. They come from a single source. And that is not to say that you cannot take that mono audio, that mono dialogue that you capture, and then put it into a stereo mix. And that involves adding stereophonic type effects to the voice. And the same goes for surround. You could certainly, we've all seen action movies, especially as a perfect example, where a voice kind of moves across the sound field, and that's perfectly fine. In a lot of those cases, even those are being recorded in mono, and then it's in the mixing stage that they use the fancier effects in terms of stereo and surround. So let me show you some information, or just kind of give you a little bit more information on why I kind of approach recording dialogue audio that way, and hopefully that'll make a little bit more sense. So let me just share this here. Okay. All right. This is kind of this is, yeah, these are not the best drawings, but they will serve our purposes here today. Let me just zoom these in a little bit here. Right. If we consider, if you look at these waves here, so say for example, we have a waveform, and this is a sound, and we also have another sound source at the same time. So say for example, this is the left speaker on a stereo system, and this is the right speaker. When you sum the two of those together, say for example, you're sitting right in the middle of those and you sum them together, or even if you are in the mixing stage and you have this on one track and this on a separate track, when you combine those together, there's actually something that occurs that's called constructive interference. And what that is that the amplitude of these two waveforms essentially combine and make a waveform with greater amplitude. like this. So you can see the difference between this and this. The amplitude is much greater on this waveform. So that's what happens in some cases. That is what happens, say, for example, if you have two microphones. One microphone captures this, the other microphone captures that, and you can end up with this. Okay, so that's our first thing. Now, consider these two waveforms here. These two waveforms are what we call 180 degrees out of phase. So, for example, you see this one, its peak is here. At the same time that this microphone may be capturing this wave with the peak right here, this microphone may be capturing this wave with the trough right here. And if they're the same amplitude and you sum these two together in a mix, you actually get destructive interference and you end up with nothing, no sound at all, because these essentially cancel each other out. Again, this is at its trough, this is at its peak or apex. Those two cancel themselves out and you go right to the center line where you get no sound at all. So this is kind of an illustration of what we first of all call constructive interference. That's this one here where the waveform grows in amplitude. And we have destructive interference where when you have two waveforms that are perfectly out of phase or 180 degrees out of phase, that you actually get destructive interference and you end up with less sound. Now, this is in a perfect kind of theoretical world. In reality, it works a little differently. So here's another illustration of the exact same thing. Say, for example, and here they're using the example of speakers. If you sum the two of these, if they're perfectly in phase and the apex and the troughs are at the exact same place, you get this constructive interference and you get this additional amplitude in the overall effect. So that's one thing. Now here's some other examples here. We gave you the dead spot example. So again, if we have these two waveforms that are perfectly out of phase, 180 degrees out of phase, you sum them together, you get nothing. That's the red line in the middle. But in reality, it works a little bit more like this right here. These two actually, constructive interference. Oftentimes, say for example, if you record on one microphone, the green wave here, and on another microphone, the blue wave here, this actually ends up with a constructive interference type of thing, and you'll get this additional amplitude. And the red represents the sum of the two of those. So once you do your final mix, for example, it'll actually be louder if this is sustained over time than these two individuals on their own. So what this is, what all I'm talking about here to illustrate, and this is it's just at one frequency here, but what I'm trying to illustrate here is that when you record with two microphones, and if they're not pretty much perfectly the same distance from the sound source, um, then you can run into these types of situations. And you end up with an effect that actually degrades the quality, typically, not always, but typically will degrade the quality of the dialogue. It will sound less natural. It'll often have strange sounds to it, strange effects. Sometimes when you stream audio, for example, on the internet, and you'll sometimes get that really kind of metallic, edgy kind of sound to the sound that's streaming. And that's, I think, kind of an example of some of the things you can sometimes run into in these scenarios. And again, it's not perfect. It's never exactly, well, it's very rarely how it works in this dead spot example here. And again, let me zoom that in a little bit so we can see it a little better. But this dead spot example, this is actually how noise canceling headphones typically work. Is they actually have a microphone on the outside of the headphones that are capturing the noise that's occurring outside, and they, as quickly as possible, produce a wave form inside the headphones that are exactly opposite in phase, and it cancels out the exterior noise. So that's the idea with noise canceling headphones. So they actually use it to their advantage. But when we're recording audio, typically we don't want to do that. And as soon as you bring in two or more microphones to capture dialogue or anything else, you potentially bring in a lot of risk in terms of creating this destructive or constructive interference and getting a less natural sound. Now, so those are some things to consider. Now, there's also something called comb filtering. And there was one paragraph here I wanted to read about this guy here. I'll put these links in the show notes below if you want to come back and look at these in more detail. But here's an example here where they give a definition for comb filtering. This is basically a delayed version of a primary signal that is produced when two or more loudspeakers are playing the same signal at different distances from the listener. In any enclosed space, such as a music or theater room, listeners hear a mixture of direct and reflected sound. Because the reflected sound takes longer to reach our ears, it constitutes a delayed version of the direct sound, and a comb filter is created where the two combine at the listener. The extent of its audibility depends on how lively the room is, to allow the reflected sounds to average out the overall response. So, in short, what they're saying is kind of describing these effects here, is what happens not only when you record with two microphones and they're not perfectly at the same distance from the sound source, but also the same thing happens with speakers. If you're sitting in a room and you're farther from one speaker than the other, then you'll start to get these comb filtering effects. And that can happen to varying degrees. So, what I would recommend is that when you're first starting with your recordings of dialogue in particular, I would stay away from stereo and certainly away from surround and just go with mono. And then, if you do need to put your dialogue into a stereo mix, which many times we do, there are a few different things to consider when you're doing that. And let me just show you something right here. I'm going to stop sharing that and I'm going to pull open Audition. Let's see here. Share that. Okay. This, now this looks like I actually did do a multi-channel recording of the same thing. In reality, this was recorded on my Zoom F8, and in this particular case, I recorded an ISO track. That's this first one. In other words, this is the direct recording of the single mic that I was recording dialogue with. And then we also have the stereo mix track, and actually these are just exact copies of that. So normally, if you think of it in these terms, this is what I really captured for my dialogue sound. And honestly, in most cases, even in a surround mix or in a stereo mix, either one, in most cases, you want the dialogue in most cases, in most scenes, in most movies, and in most videos that you're doing, you really want the dialogue to be kind of front and center. And in that case, what you do is you simply, in the case of stereo, what I might do here is I might right click, choose convert sample type. Yeah, sample type. And I'm going to convert it to stereo. And really what I'm doing is I'm simply making a copy of this, this mono signal that I captured, and I'm putting it so that it's on the left channel and the exact same thing is on the right channel. So there's no panning whatsoever. So these are going to be perfectly in phase. And as a result, it'll sound like it's kind of in front and center of the mix. And even in surround mixes, almost always the dialogue scenes are going to be mixed to the front center speaker because that's typically where you want your dialogue. Now, what you could do, and I'll just undo that here real quick. If you were doing a surround mix and you actually wanted this voice, say it's someone running through the scene somehow, maybe running past another character who's the point of view, you might actually want to pan this other dialogue track to make it feel as if the character is actually moving across the screen, not only visually, but also in an audio sense. And in that case, there's actually some mixing that goes on where you can actually, again, take this mono dialogue signal or sound recording, and you can actually pan it across a surround field. And that's a little bit more than I wanted to talk about here today in terms of the details on how to do that. You can do that here in Audition. Obviously, Pro Tools also allows you to do that. So that's kind of the main idea. Is again, almost all of the field mixers and even studio mixers that are doing sound or dialogue in particular for film, they're almost always recording the dialogue as a mono signal, and then it's in post that they either make it stereo or surround and mix it into a stereo or surround overall track. So I feel like I've kind of beat that one to death. I didn't want to go on too long, but I think this is a good time to kind of pause and answer Gary's question which was, hey, Curtis, um, are matched pairs set up in an XY configuration a good option? And are they an economical option for the amateur filmmaker? And I think the answer to that is certainly yes. Again, in this context, what I would suggest is if you're going to do a stereo recording, I would reserve that for sound effects or ambient type recordings as opposed to dialogue recordings. And so, for example, there was a review that I did a couple of weeks ago of the Asden SMX30 camera top shotgun microphone, which also has a stereo array up on the top, and it's actually configured. This is what Gary's talking about. It's in an XY pattern where the two microphones are kind of configured like this, where the capsules are really, really very close to one another, and they're kind of set in this type of pattern. And the pickup pattern on both of the capsules is a cardioid pickup. So it's essentially this one over here is capturing the sound over here, and this one over here is capturing the sound over here. And again, for ambiance, I think that can produce a really interesting sound, and that actually can be even save you some time in post. And yes, there are going to be some phase effects, um, but in that particular case, that may be something that is desirable. So typically, I would reserve stereo recordings for those types of scenarios. And in fact, matched pair mics in an XY configuration are a good option. Again, like I said, the Zoom H1, most of the Zoom handy recorders have those stereo mics on top of the unit themselves. And again, that's the H1, the H4n, the H5, the H6 all have that as a built-in option. And yeah, I think that's a good economical option for the amateur filmmaker. So those are some thoughts on that. So thanks for that question, Gary. That was really, I appreciate that. Um, let's see, what else can we do here? Let's show you some more in Audition here. There we go. Share our screen. It looks like, sorry for the delay here. Let's pull that up again. Okay, there, now we can share it. All right. Again, let me just show you at a very simple level what I typically do for, again, a dialogue track. So I almost always want it, again, I'm generally going to produce a stereo track for my finished video piece. And I'm going to do a couple of things here. I'm going to go ahead and run through this process. We have a few minutes here. I'm going to go to RX5. Again, we've talked about that. This is expensive, but let me just show you again. We've talked about this in the past. But the reason I go here, first of all, is you'll notice that these waveforms are asymmetric. Here's a perfect example. Center line is right here. You'll notice that the peaks on this side extend farther. Their apex has a greater amplitude than the trough does down here. So this often happens on male dialogue recordings and with certain microphones and particular voices. This is my voice here, and I get it all the time. RX has this really nice channel ops processor, which has adaptive phase rotation. So I'm gonna go ahead and process that and watch what happens to the waveforms here when it finishes that processing. You can see now this waveform, which was very asymmetric before, now looks pretty symmetric here. Pretty much the same amount. And it doesn't change the overall sound in any sort of drastic way, or even in any way I've ever been able to find. And the reason I do that is that now I have a little bit more headroom. So instead of this peak going all the way up here and this peak only being about, or this trough only being about right there, now I have a little bit more headroom so I can do my compression and loudness normalizing and save myself some grief. Unfortunately, Adobe Audition does not have that option. So that's why I do that over in Isotope RX5. So I can just round trip that, bring it back, and now we have our audio that has been phase rotated. So what I would do next then is I would take the audio and let's just loudness normalize this. Say I'm going to go to minus 23 LUFS, which is European Broadcast Loudness Standard. Let's run that, see how that looks. Actually, before I do that, let's undo. I need to actually convert to, well, I have two options. Minus 23 is the target for the European Broadcast Loudness Standard when you're talking about a stereo track. That means that it's going to be 3 dB lower for mono. So I'm going to change this to minus 26. So if I again have a mono track so far, and go ahead and run that. And once I've got that, then I can right click and I'm going to convert this to stereo. Okay, now it's stereo. What's interesting, watch what happens now. Remember, we just loudness normalized that mono track to minus 26. Take a look at this. We're going to go to amplitude statistics, and we're going to scan this entire file. It now says that the overall loudness is minus 22.99, or in effect, minus 23. So as soon as you take something from mono to stereo, um, and you leave it, both channels are identical. So this is like essentially dual mono. Um, the overall loudness increases by 3 dB, or sorry, not 3 dB, but 3 LUFS, 3 loudness units. So that's typically what I'm going to do for almost all of my dialogue. So all the pieces that I put up in the training course on learnlightandsound.com, all of them I've done this with that, and everything that goes on YouTube, I do the same thing, same idea. So that's what I'm typically doing. Now, if you wanted to apply some sort of stereophonic effect where you kind of have something dynamically pan from the right channel to the left channel, you can do that stuff as well, but I think you have to go into this is where I don't have quite as much experience because I'm not typically doing mixing in um, surround. I've done a little bit, but not much, and it's been a long time. But you can do some effects here, and I think there's a way. Yeah, I'm gonna have to come back to that. I apologize. I shouldn't go there again since I don't do a lot of surround mixing. But that's the idea. Here in Adobe Audition, there is a way where you can do again your surround mixing, and you have to convert the track to surround, and you can take it from there, or your mix to surround. All right. So that's some thoughts initially on stereo versus mono versus surround mixing and recording. Again, dialogue 99.9% of the time recorded in mono and then mixed to stereo or to surround. And that includes the major motion pictures, the major feature films. So don't stress yourself out. Don't think that, oh, I'm going to get higher quality, or I'm going to get a richer voice response, or I'm going to get a richer sound out of my dialogue if I can record it in stereo. And this also goes, I've had this question quite a bit as well. I mean, this is again not a bad assumption when you're starting out, because um, it's I think natural, and certainly I had the same thought to myself. Why don't I mic with a lavalier and a boom microphone and then mix them together in the final mix? Well, again, your potential to run into phase issues is pretty big when you start doing something like that. And that is to say, if you're going to have them at the same time. Now, if you're cutting between them and you're just using one at a time, that's going to be okay. So, for example, a lot of times, what the field mixers will do is they'll actually lav all the actors up. The major actors that have lines will get a lavalier or a radio mic, and then they'll also use a boom microphone. And if for some reason the boom audio for any particular dialogue line is not usable, they may then fall back to the lavalier recorded or the lavalier track for that particular actor for that particular line. Now, if they cut the boom line and they use the lavalier line, then you're not going to run into that phasing issue. But if you try to mix both of them together on that same exact line, essentially use the audio from both the lavalier and the boom mic, that's when you start running into the phase issues. So if you have any questions about this, or you have curiosity about what it sounds like, try it. Try recording both a lavalier and a boom mic on a dialogue line and mix them together and see what happens. If you've got a stereo recorder, you can hook both your mics up to that stereo recorder. Give it a try. Typically, again, for dialogue, is not going to make anything better, and the potential of making things worse is pretty significant. So, there's some thoughts on that. Okay, let's come back over here. I'm going to check in and see if we have any other questions over on. If you have any questions, here. Those of you that are watching live, let's see if there's anything in the Q&A section. No, nothing in the Q&A section. And I'll do a sweep here of the Google Plus page. Let's see if we've got anything there. Nope, we have the question from Gary. So Gary, again, thanks for that. I appreciate that question. If even if you have a different experience or other insights on this, certainly leave those on the Google Plus page. We'd love to hear from you on that and your experiences with stereo recording of dialogue. Again, not not something that I think you're going to find generally useful. So I wanted to share that with you. I'm not saying don't record with two mics. I'm just saying that when you do your final mix, you probably don't want to mix both of the mics together. You want to leave them separate. And if you have to cut, again, if there was noise on the or something strange happened with the boom mic, maybe there was a cable slapping against the boom pole, or something happened, or the boom operator moved it too quickly and you picked up some wind noise. And you need to cut to the lavalier, that's a perfect time to do that. But again, that's where you want to sort of railroad your different tracks and only use one of them at a time. All right, that is what I had prepared for today's session. I hope that was helpful for you. I wanted to thank everyone who attends and who has left comments. And even if you haven't, I hope this is helpful and that you're getting useful information from this. Thanks again for checking in, and we will talk to you again next week. Take care, everybody.